This is Dorothy here again. I have a little bit of story for you today. Well, it's a little bit of history, I should have said, not a little bit of story. My mother, as I told you earlier, had a shop in Thomas Street in Dublin, in the Liberties. This is apart from the one she had in Corn Market. She moved to Thomas Street years later. So we had a lot of dealings with the very, very poor people of Dublin who sold fruit in that area and had stalls selling all sorts of household things and anything you could think of, they'd sell. And they were all lovely people. I remember there was one particular girl who sold outside Mummy's shop. Her name was Martha, and she happened to be the same age as me. And we kind of struck up a chatty friendship whenever I'd come in. And she had a boyfriend the same time that I was going out with Noel. So anyway, she stopped me one day all excited. She said, "We're after getting engaged." And I said, "Oh, that's lovely, you know. And when are you getting married?" She said, "I don't know." She said, "I'm having them in for the tryout first." And I said, "The what?" So anyway, she said, "I'm having him in for the tryout." So apparently, she was one of 10 children. So the parents and the 10 children shared the one room in a tenement. Now, this was very, very normal in Thomas Street area and the Liberties in the 40s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and indeed the 60s. So anyway, I said to her, "My God," I said, "that is just very, very difficult, you know, to think about all you people all in the one room." Anyway, I didn't give it too much thought, but it just showed me the poverty and the conditions they were living in. No bathroom. Yeah, so anyway, they were all lovely, lovely people. And then we had the shop there in number 71, and we used to specialise in children's first communion, confirmation, teenage clothes. And the poverty was just abject. And the women, my God, I've never met a woman there who had a coat. They all had shawls. They couldn't afford a coat. They had a shawl and a kind of a makeshift pulled around black skirt. And they were never unhappy. They were always laughing and joking. If they had a little bit of entertainment, it was to go into the pub, but they're only allowed into the snug. They weren't allowed where the men were. So they'd go in with their couple of pence and they'd get a milk stout. But they were lovely, innocent, happy people with no money and good sense of being grateful for what they had. But the one thing they did was they made sure that their children were dressed properly for all the sacraments, particularly First Communion. So I used to go in and help my mum in the school holidays and Saturdays, and they were very, very busy. So this is where I got a lot of information. First of all, I couldn't understand why they were all buying blankets. So the orders would come in for blankets, and the blankets would come beautifully wrapped in cellophane. Now, we didn't have plastic in those days, but lovely, crispy feel cellophane, and they'd come in and they'd pick up their blanket bundle, and off they go. So I said to Mummy one day, "Why are they buying all these blankets?" So she said, "Oh, it's very sad." She said, "They have no money, so they have to buy the blankets to pawn them." So I said, "Well, how can they buy blankets if they've no money?" And then I heard how they did their shopping. There were companies in Dublin. One of them was called the Dublin Supply Company, and the other was called the Metropolitan. Now, there were several of them, but these were called trading check companies. So what happened was that the customer got in touch with a representative from, we'll say, the Dublin Supply, and they borrowed a cheque for £5. Now, on that cheque would be the number of the cheque and the name of the company. So when they go into a store to buy something, the shop would add in their stamp and how much was spent, and then they'd tot up how much was left. So say they had spent £3, there's £2 left on the cheque. Then at the end of the month, the customer, they paid weekly into the trading cheque company, but at the end of the month, the shops would send in the number of the trading cheque, the person's name and the amount, and they would pay the shops. So in the meantime, when the lady who got the cheque was paying back, she paid a £0.50 commission in every pound she borrowed. Now, a £0.50 was 2 shillings and sixpence, the equivalent of about €12 now. And that's what they would spend on. I hope I'm right about the euro bit, don't hold that against me. But anyway, it was a lot of commission, and the shop paid the same. It was stopped off their bill. So they got 5 shillings in every pound, and a pound was 20 shillings. So they were making a very good living. So then the woman come into the shop and she'd buy, we'll just talk about the blankets for the moment, and she'd hand her cheque in, and there'd be whatever, the blankets might cost £1, say, and down she'd hand in the cheque and she'd get the blankets, and then she'd go to the pawn and he'd give her probably 15 shillings, and that would give her money to buy whatever bills she had coming in. But it was really the toughest life they lived. But you'd never hear them complaining or unhappy. And they all seemed to love their children, and they loved their mothers. Now, there wasn't an awful lot of talk about the fathers. And I'm sure they were very good men, some of them, but unfortunately in that area where we were, they weren't very good earners, so the women didn't have a lot of good things to say if they'd be listened to. But it struck me as a child how happy they were and how delighted they were to get the best of clothes for their children's first communion and the confirmation. And they didn't seem to care what it cost. In fact, if we decided to get something that was a bit cheaper quality, you couldn't sell it. They wouldn't buy it. So it's amazing dealing with these people, how much you kind of learn about life. And then they just idolise the mothers. And Mummy would take me sometimes to a removal of, say, somebody who had died, some granny that had died, and you'd be brought down to the house and there'd be a big blaze and firelight. And this is now not the tenements now, this was the Guinness's cottages. And the dead body would be laid out, and they'd all be sitting in the room having a glass of stout and talking about the wonderful woman. And I, as about a 9 and 10-year-old, I used to think these were all canonisable people. There were so many good things they did. But this is what you'd hear, never a bad word. But it stuck in my memory, the poverty and yet not too much sadness. And the children were well looked after as well as they could look after them. And then they had a thing called dip in the dip. And dip in the dip was they'd make a big stew with potatoes and onions and vegetables, and they'd throw in a herring into it, a fish. So the saying was in Dublin, dip in the dip and leave the herring for your father. So they'd have bread and they'd dip in this big bowl in the centre, and that was their food mostly. The poverty was just unbelievable. I've never since or before seen anything like it. But they managed to live and get by, and then there were a few characters around. There was one man, and he was called Madser Quigley. And Madser was a real kind of, nowadays you'd call him a con man, but he was full of the old charm. And one day I met him, and at this stage I was about 17 or 18, so I was earning a little bit of money. I think I must have got about £2.50 or 10 shillings a week. So Madser comes in and he calls me Miss Mac. Now the shop was called MacDonald's because that was my mother's maiden name, MacDonald, and all her sisters and her brothers, when they bought businesses, called them MacDonald's. So there was a few of them around Dublin. So anyway, Madser comes in and I'm there and he says to me, it's payday, right? So he says to me, oh, Miss Mac. Now, my name was Dorothy Ledwidge, but Miss Mac, I'm going on the boat tonight to England. I'm getting a job on the buildings. Oh, I said, oh, that's great, Madser. Wish you the best of luck. And he said, I only have the price of the ticket, but he said, would there be any chance of getting a £0.50 off, he said, for a sandwich and a drop of tea on the boat? So I said, well, a £0.50 is an awful lot of money to me, Madser, you know. Oh, well, he said, I'd be starving and it'd be the difference now in me getting something to eat on that 4-hour boat journey to Holyhead. So I gave him the £0.50 anyway. And I said, now, Madser, this is not for the pub. And he said, oh, not at all. He said, this is for the boat tonight. So he went out the door of the shop and I looked and the next thing I saw him crossing the road straight into the pub. So out I went. Now, bearing in mind, I'm a young one, not even 17 at the time. And over I went after him. And he just sat up at the counter, about to give his order, when I said, now I'll have that £0.50 back. He said, what? I said, you told me it was for the boat tonight. Anyway, to cut a long story short, he said, missus, will you have a heart? I said, no, I'll have a £0.50, thank you very much. And I took it from him and I went out. And I felt like a right rip, but at the same time, he had totally conned me. But all in kind of innocence, and that was the way he lived. And then we had another guy, he used to stand on the platform of the bus. And the bus at that stage had a kind of a rail for people to hold on to getting in, a pole. So when he got near a stop, he'd hang on that pole and he'd hang out of the bus and he'd shout, bang, bang. So he was known as Bang Bang from Inchicore. Apparently, my father told me he was shell-shocked during the war. There was a lot of people shell-shocked, which is a dreadful thing when you think about it. A shell goes off around you and your life is changed for the rest of your life. But poor old Bang Bang went down in history anyway. And people would stand at the bus stop and pretend to fall over that he'd shot them. So that was just another character in Thomas Street. But I learned an awful lot, and then there was some elderly ladies who would have a couple of children working, and they were a bit better off because they'd have a little cottage and they were able to feed their children. And some of them ran what was known as money clubs. So what happened with that is you started, say, a 12-week or a 20-week money club, and you decided you'd put in £1 a week. So then that would mean that at the end of 12 weeks, you'd have £1. Now, I can hear you saying to yourself, well, that wouldn't buy you much. But remember then, you could get a packet of cigarettes for 6p. You could get a pint for, I suppose, 6p, 7p. Things were much, much cheaper. So life was very, very difficult for these people, but you never saw them going around crying. They all made the best of things. But I just thought you might like to know that little bit of history in Dublin. And then years later, I got a part in Sean O'Casey's Juno and the Paycock, and I was playing Maisie Madigan, who was a neighbour in one of these tenements. And if you don't know the story of Juno, they had been told they'd come into a bit of money, and they had a daughter called Mary. So anyway, they were having a party to celebrate this, and Maisie Madigan, the part I was playing, was a neighbour who couldn't resist when she'd hear there was a little drop of drink and a party going. So I arrive in to the party, Maisie, and there is their Mary, the daughter, talking to Mr. Bentham, the solicitor. Well, actually, he probably was a solicitor's clerk. So he'd come to read the details of the will. So in I butt into the whole family, arrive in, as they obviously did in those days. There was probably no hall door. You just opened the door and walked in. So I come in anyway, and I had this part I played. I loved it so much because I think nearly every festival I went into, I won Best Actress for it. But my line was coming in, looking over at this solicitor's apprentice, Mr. Bentham, talking to Mary. And I burst in the door and I say, I'm going to tell you, Mr. Bentham, that you're going to get a nice bit of skirt in Mary there, as you've seen in your natural. Not like some of the dressed up ones that's going about nowadays looking for a fella when it's a scalping they want. I remember as well as I remember yesterday, the day she was born, of a Tuesday, the 25th of June in the year 1901. At 30 minutes past 1 in the day, be Foley's Clock. That's the pub at the corner of the street. And a cold day it was too for the season of the year. And I remember saying to Joxer here, who I met coming up the stairs, that the new arrival at Boyle's would be a hardy chiseler if it lived. And so signs on it. Here she is today, going to be married to a young man, looking as if he'd be fit to commensurate in any position in life it had pleased God to send him to. So that was Maisie Madigan arriving in for the free drink. And then Captain Boyle offers her a bottle of stout. So she says, a bottle of stout would be a bit heavy for my stomach after me dinner. I think I'll try a ball of malt. Oh, there's nothing like a ball of malt. Occasionally, like, too much of it isn't good for you. Of course, you know, the ball of malt was a drop of whiskey. So, so that gives you an idea of the tenement life as portrayed by Sean O'Casey. And a wonderful, wonderful play. And then he did The Plough and the Stars. So when he did that in the Abbey, there were riots out on the street about it. All the people rebelled and there was uproar. But it still survived, and I played in that as well, Bessie Burgess. But there were wonderful pieces of Irish history written in such good poetic language that it was a pleasure to act in them. I also did Brendan Behan's play, The Hostage. Oh my goodness, that was something else. Leo Hart directed it in Lucan, and he did the Joan Plowright edition of it, which was a kind of a little bit farcical with plenty of music and singing in it. So he had all the ladies from Lucan. Now this now, mind you, is in the 70s. And he had them dressed up. I won't call it like what, but anyway, suffice it to say that my part was Meg. And the title of the description of Meg was The Her with the Heart of Gold. So needless to say, being a Brendan Behan play, oh my God, some of the things you had to say were outrageous. But there was one scene when I had to say a B word. Now, bearing in mind that my husband is living in Lucan in the bank and he's assistant manager at this stage, and here I am in the Spa Hotel on the stage playing in The Hostage. So anyway, Noel said to me, Dor, please don't say that B word. He said, it is very offensive. So I said, what am I going to do? So anyway, you have to say what the author says. So I thought I got a great brainwave. So the man that I was to use the profanity to, his line was, I'll have you know my antecedents came from Kilcock. And my line back to him was, I'll cock you, you scowling little. So I thought, what am I going to do? So I got a sweeping brush and I put the non-brush head, the handle point up right at his posterior. And when he said his line, I said, I'll cock you. And of course I could say the other line nice and quietly, nobody heard it. because the old cocky with the sweeping brush got such a great big howl of laughter that it totally drowned out the obscenity. But that's just one little bit of the story out of that. But I won't give you any more because they're unbelievable. So experience in plays, you do so many different plays, but the Dublin ones like Bean and O'Casey were great to show you what life was like. And then I had the privilege of seeing it at first hand. And I think it's very important now for all you generation of people to know that Dublin in those days was a totally and completely different place. There wasn't hardly a car on the roads. There were cobblestones everywhere. There were horses doing deliveries, horse-drawn carts. There was Powers whiskey cart. There was Guinness, had loads of them going around. And they did deliveries to all the pubs. And then there was the clatter on the cobblestones of the hard wheels on the horse and carts. And interestingly enough, my grandfather, MacDonald, came from Tinnahealy, and he was working on a farm down there. So he got a job with the horses in Guinnesses. And some days he would take out the horse and do a delivery. And Noel's grandfather got a job with the horses in Powers Whiskey Distillery. So they would have passed each other by and they'd salute each other, because I often saw this happening on the street. And not knowing that years later, one of the grandsons would marry the other's granddaughter. So that was just a little story about my connection with the transport in Dublin. So I hope you enjoy that little bit of history. Now, it's not something you could enjoy, but it might enlighten you. So thank you for listening to it.